Maria's calloused fingers trembled as she held the platinum band up to the morning light streaming through the mansion's crystal windows. 23 years of marriage reduced to this cold circle of metal, and now it lay in the palm of a woman who earned in a year what the ring's owner spent on a single dinner. The irony wasn't lost on Hiroshi, who had never owned anything more valuable than her grandmother's tarnished cross, was now the keeper of someone else's most precious symbol of love. The Whitmore mansion had been Maria's second home for 15 years. She'd arrived as a young mother desperate for work, her English broken but her determination unshakable. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had hired her not out of pity, but because she recognized something in Maria's eyes that reminded her of her own immigrant grandmother, a fierce pride wrapped in humility, a work ethic that couldn't be taught or bought. Over the years, Maria had watched the Whitmore family's joys and sorrows unfold like chapters in a novel she was privileged to witness but never truly part of. She'd cleaned up after birthday parties where the decorations cost more than her monthly salary, she'd quietly replaced family photos when arguments left them shattered on marble floors. She'd seen love bloom with her, success celebrated and failure mourned, all while remaining the invisible force that kept their world spinning smoothly. But nothing had prepared her for what she'd witnessed the night before. Mr. James Whitmore, the tech mogul whose innovations had changed how the world communicated, had been pacing his study like a caged animal. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his silver hair uncombed, his tie loosened and hanging askew. Maria had been finishing her evening duties when she heard the sound that stopped her in her tracks, a grown man sobbing with the raw, unguarded grief of someone who thought no one was watching. Through the slightly open door, she'd seen him standing at his mahogany desk, holding the ring in his shaking hands. The divorce papers lay scattered before him like fallen leaves, each page a testament to the end of a love story that had once seemed unshakable. Eleanor had moved out that morning, taking only her clothes and leaving behind 23 years of shared memories embedded in every corner of the house. "I failed her," James had whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. "I gave her everything except what she needed most, my time, my presence, my attention. I built an empire and lost my empress." Maria had wanted to retreat, to give him privacy in his moment of devastation, but something in his voice had rooted her to the spot. This wasn't the commanding CEO who conducted board meetings with military precision. This wasn't the confident public speaker who'd addressed Congress about technology's role in shaping America's future. This was simply a broken man realizing that all his wealth couldn't purchase back the love he'd taken for granted. He'd placed the ring on the desk and stumbled toward the window, staring out at the sprawling grounds that suddenly seemed as empty as his marriage. "What's the point of any of this if you have no one to share it with?" he'd asked the darkness. That's when Maria had made a decision that would change everything. She'd quietly entered the room, and without a word, had begun collecting the scattered papers. James had turned, startled to find he wasn't alone, his eyes red-rimmed and vulnerable in a way that made Maria's heart ache for him. "Mrs. Santos," he'd said, trying to compose himself, "I didn't realize you were still here." "Mr. Whitmore," she'd replied gently, her accented English soft but clear. "Sometimes the heart needs time to heal before the head can think clearly." He looked at her with surprise, perhaps realizing for the first time in years that she was more than just the woman who kept his house clean. She was a human being with wisdom earned through her own struggles, her own losses, her own journey through life's inevitable heartbreaks. "I don't know how to fix this," he'd admitted, gesturing helplessly at the papers in her hands. "Maybe," Maria had said carefully, "it's not about fixing. Maybe it's about understanding." Now, in the bright light of the new day, Maria stood in that same study, the wedding ring still in her palm. She'd found it on the floor where it had rolled after James had finally gone to bed, leaving it behind like he'd tried to leave behind his pain. But some things, Maria knew, couldn't simply be abandoned. Some things had to be faced, processed, and either healed or properly laid to rest. The sound of footsteps on the marble staircase told her James was coming down for his morning coffee, a ritual she'd observed for 15 years. He always took it black, standing at the kitchen island while scrolling through emails on his phone, already mentally at the office before his feet had even left his home. But today would be different. Today, Maria was going to do something that went far beyond her job description, something that could get her fired but felt more important than her paycheck. She heard him enter the kitchen, heard the familiar sounds of his morning routine, the coffee machine humming to life, the soft clink of porcelain, the quiet beep of his phone receiving messages from a world that never stopped demanding his attention. "Mrs. Santos," his voice carried a note of confusion. "What are you doing in the study so early?" Maria took a deep breath and stepped into the kitchen. James was standing exactly where she'd expected, coffee mug in one hand, phone in the other, but his eyes immediately fell to what she was holding. The ring seemed to catch every beam of morning light, throwing tiny rainbows across the white marble countertop. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. "You dropped this last night," Maria said simply, extending her hand. James stared at the ring as if it were a ghost from a life he'd thought he'd buried. Slowly, he set down his coffee and phone, his movements careful and deliberate. "I thought I'd lost it," he whispered. "Mr. Whitmore," Maria said, her voice gentle but firm, "I have something to tell you, something I should have said long ago." He looked up at her, and she saw that same vulnerability from the night before, the same raw humanity that success and wealth had buried but never quite destroyed. "15 years I work in this house," she began, her accent thickening with emotion. "15 years I watch your family. I see the love you and Mrs. Eleanor had, a real love, deep love. But I also see how the business, the money, the success. It became like a wall between you." James opened his mouth to speak, but Maria held up her hand. "Please, let me finish." "Mrs. Eleanor, she didn't leave because she stopped loving you. She left because she was disappearing, becoming invisible in her own life while you disappeared into your work. I know because I know what it's like to become invisible." Tears welled in James's eyes as her words hit their target with devastating accuracy. "But here's what you don't know," Maria continued, her own voice breaking. "Every morning when you left for the office, Mrs. Eleanor would sit in the sunroom and talk to me. Not like I was the help, but like I was a friend. She would tell me about the man she fell in love with 30 years ago, the one who used to bring her flowers from the gas station because he couldn't afford the florist, the one who wrote her love letters on napkins because he didn't have fancy paper, the one who promised her that no matter how successful he became, she would always be his greatest achievement." James was crying openly now, the ring blurring in his vision. "She never stopped believing that man was still inside you," Maria said softly. "She just forgot how to reach him." With infinite gentleness, Maria took James's hand and placed the ring in his palm, closing his fingers around it. "It's not too late, Mr. Whitmore. Love like yours doesn't it just gets buried under fear and pride and the belief that providing is the same as loving. But providing is what you do with your hands. Love is what you do with your heart." What happened next would be talked about in the Whitmore mansion for years to come, though only two people would ever know the full truth of it. James Whitmore, one of America's most powerful businessmen, sank to his knees in his kitchen and wept like a child, while Maria Santos, the maid who had spent 15 years invisible in his world, held him like a mother comforting her son. "What do I do?" he sobbed. "How do I fix this?" "You start with one truth," Maria whispered. "You tell her that you're sorry not just for what you did, but for who you stopped being. And then you show her, every day, that the man she fell in love with is still alive." 3 months later, Maria was arranging flowers in the sunroom, and not the expensive orchids that usually graced the mansion's rooms, but simple daisies from the gas station down the street. Eleanor Whitmore was coming home today, not because James had promised to change, but because he had actually changed. He'd stepped back from the company, hired a CEO to run the day-to-day operations, and spent his time remembering how to be a husband instead of just a provider. The ring was back on his finger, but more importantly, the light was back in his eyes. And sometimes, when Maria caught them dancing in the kitchen to old songs on the radio, she smiled and whispered a prayer of gratitude that she'd had the courage to speak up for love when it needed a voice. Because in the end, she'd learned that being invisible wasn't her fate, it was her choice. And sometimes, the most powerful thing an invisible person can do is step into the light and remind others that they're human too.